Happy crowds in some of Syria's biggest cities toppled statues of former President Hafez Assad over the past week. In a scene like the toppling of statues of former Iraqi President Saddam Hussein in Baghdad in 2003, they were celebrating the sudden departure of Assad's son, Bashar Assad, after 24 years in power. But the fall of Bashar Assad will not bring peace and stability to Syria. The militant group that led the rebellion, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and its controversial leader, Abu Mohammed al-Golani, will struggle to convince Syrians, let alone the outside world, that they have abandoned their jihadist past. Though most Syrians are dedicated Muslims, they have little interest in religious dogma. There is little common ground among Syria's diverse ethnic and religious groups, which will prevent agreement on the fundamentals of a future political system and national identity. Complicating the situation further, the country's neighbors have set their sights on Syrian territory amid the growing uncertainty there. The Assads ruled Syria for decades with an iron fist. Their repression of the Syrian people peaked after November 1970, when Hafez Assad carried out a military coup in which he overthrew his partner in power, Salah Jadid. Official propaganda called Assad the eternal leader, and statues of his image were erected in every city and town throughout the country. His exercise of absolute power and coercion of the Syrian people eventually led to the degradation of Syria's state institutions. He projected an air of invincibility and permanency. His ability to provide essential welfare services to the Syrian people enabled him to use unprecedented repressive measures against those who opposed his rule. Even though per capita income dropped from $1,470 in 1980 to $990 in 1990, the decline of the country's material resources did not reduce the application of despotic measures against those who dared to challenge his domestic and foreign policies. Corruption, traditionally a common feature of Syria's public institutions, escalated under Hafez's reign. He accepted it as a form of patronage. When Hafez died in 2000, Bashar succeeded him at just 34 years of age, in violation of the Syrian constitution, which stipulated that the president should be no younger than 40 years old. But the Assad dynasty was always bound to fall. Repressive regimes, especially if they are endemically corrupt and fail to provide adequate services to their people and adapt their political systems to changing domestic and external conditions, eventually decay and collapse, often suddenly and unexpectedly. Per capita income in Syria reached $1,500 on the eve of the 2011 uprising, but declined to $745 in 2021 after the civil war took a heavy toll on the economy. Bashar Assad's regime would have collapsed in 2015 were it not for the support of Russian air power and Iranian proxies. The insurgency that brought down Assad this past weekend was led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, which many Western governments have designated a terrorist group. The head of HTS, Abu Mohammed al-Golani, has a long history of militancy. After joining al-Qaeda, he participated in the fight against U.S. forces that invaded Iraq in 2003. He moved to Lebanon in 2006, where he supervised training for fighters for Jund al-Sham, a Salafist jihadi organization. He then returned to Iraq in 2008 to fight for the Islamic State group. The U.S. Army briefly arrested him, and following his release, he moved to Syria after the 2011 uprising against Assad. He established the transnational Jihadi al-Nusra Front, focusing on Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon. After Assad regained control of Aleppo in late 2016, al-Golani changed the name of the group to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. He settled in the province of Idlib and established the Syrian Salvation Government, abandoning the doctrine of transnational jihad to focus on Syria instead. He declared that his goal had shifted to eliminating the Assad regime and establishing Islamic rule in Syria, saying that his membership in al-Qaeda and association with the Islamic State group were a thing of the past. He consolidated his authoritarian control over Idlib and marginalized other opposition groups, both religious and secular. The recent developments shouldn't be shocking considering Syria's past. After gaining independence in 1943, Syria became an arena of competition as Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Turkey, and Britain wrestled for influence. Against all odds, Hafez Assad managed to make Syria a regional power. But Bashar, fearing that the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq would eventually lead to his own overthrow, aligned with Iran, which dominated Syria's political system after the 2011 uprising. Soon after the rebellion began last month, the Syrian regime's demoralized forces, who had been fighting a war for more than 13 years, collapsed. The rebels decided to continue their offensive after capturing Aleppo, seizing Hama despite heavy Russian air raids, and moved south to Homs, which they took without a fight. Members of the Druze religious sect in Swaida province launched a separate campaign, which led regime officials to flee without much resistance. The rebels there carried the five-colored Druze flag, rather than the flag of the Syrian uprising. In Daraa, the site of the 2011 protests that launched the civil war, other rebel factions seized the area that straddled the borders with Israel and Jordan, following the army's withdrawal.
Whatever you think of this war, and there's a lot of things to think, this is only the beginning of a series of strategic humiliations for the Russians, and regardless of how this is sorted out one way or the other, that just got cut off because the Russians can no longer supply any of it. So we're going to see this cascade of strategic collapses of the Russian position throughout the entire Middle Eastern theater, throughout the entire African theater, and it's probably not going to take any more than a few weeks to months. So stay tuned, get some popcorn, there's going to be a show.
This is a zone that is bracketed by a number of other regions that all matter. The Aegean, the Caucasus, southern Ukraine and the Crimean Peninsula, the Balkans, Mesopotamia, the Levant. The Turks can't project and do project power into all of these regions, but the Sea of Marmara region is not sufficiently powerful to give the Turks the ability to project in all of them. And so Turkish foreign strategic policy has always been about making choices. The Turks didn't want to see an independent Kurdistan, but the Americans relied upon the Kurds of northern Iraq in order to fight part of the war against Saddam Hussein. And with the Syrian civil war, you had again a Kurdish enclave in northeast Syria that basically existed under Western de facto sponsorship.